I know you must be excited that Robert Kennedy Jr. has been appointed at the position to help make America healthy again, because you know he's been here several times talking about all the things we're talking about. He wrote the book, The Real Anthony Fauci. He's like that thick, New York Times bestseller. But let's talk about, what did Anthony Fauci say early on about COVID and how it got here, how it started? Because you talk about all of this moving beyond the COVID-19 lies. That's the book right there by Dr. Bryan Ardis. Talk a little bit about what Dr. Fauci told us, what secular media told us, but what the truth is.
Yeah, this is a huge, I cannot believe how far this lie went around the world. So the first lie was they believed it came from a bat, like a bat coughed on everybody else in China and made the whole world sick. That's actually the title of my first chapter.
You have to get really close to a bat for a bat to cough on you.
You have to be within 6 feet.
Yeah.
Remember, it only goes 6 feet,
pretty far
that
deep
virus.
into a cave.
Not only that, but it's only when you
I don't even know
sit down.
if they actually cough, right?
No, only when you're standing up. When you sit.
That's right. When you're in a restaurant, remember, you could sit, without a mask on.
Oh, that's why it
You
works.
couldn't stand.
That's why it works, because
virus-
bats fly.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So
I never could
viruses
figure that out.
do not affect people
You
3
sit down,
feet,
you
4
can
feet
take your mask
lower.
off. Okay, got it.
Right.
Only those standing. All right, so there's a bunch of ridiculous things. So we were told it actually came from a bat. Then we were told maybe it came from a seafood market. Now you have to understand, this is a respiratory virus. That means it's spread through the air.
Right.
You have to inhale it. So are you to believe that some seafood in a Wuhan market in China coughed, some dead fish on ice, coughed on an innocent customer walking through the shop? This is about the only way that could happen. Then they wanted to blame it on a pangolin, that a pangolin must have coughed on somebody and made them sick. The most recent thing in 2023, the CDC published they believe a raccoon dog started the entire COVID-19 pandemic. You ever seen one of those?
A raccoon dog.
How many human beings have been coughed on by a raccoon dog? I'd like to know. It's pretty ridiculous. But now they've settled on it must have been a lab leak, even though we heard the rumors it could have been a lab leak. This definitely was created in a lab. Mm-hmm. It's created in labs all around the world, not just Wuhan. But the American government agencies want you to think it just came from China. Let's blame somebody else, when in fact, the majority of the funding went through out of our United States government to the North Carolina, to Richard Barrett, or to Ralph Barrick, who then gave money to Eco Health Alliance in New England, and then transferred that money to Wuhan and other biological weapons.
And that can all be
facilities.
proven.
It's only in Anthony Fauci's emails
Yeah.
that Rand Paul did such a great job, Senator of Kentucky, making sure everybody knew that he knew.
Mm-hmm. So it was created. Talk a little bit about what made it so dangerous.
Yeah, so this is really incredible. So for everybody, please pay attention here. There are millions of people around the world right now who are still suffering with symptoms related to COVID, called now long COVID. And if you're watching, there's somebody in your life who's either struggling to breathe, still get their oxygen levels up, they have loss of taste and smell to this day, ringing in their ears, they have dementia, they have brain fog, they have exercise-induced asthma, they have insomnia. These are all called long COVID symptoms.
Not to mention so many much worse than even that.
Right.
Like nervous.
All the clots and all that.
Exactly right. So I want to mention what we know that is creating all of these symptoms that linger for so long. There's currently over 200 long COVID symptoms. Those all started by you getting a mild case of COVID, and then these symptoms just persisted. They wouldn't go away. Sometimes your infection would go away, all symptoms of fever, cough, breathing, all that disappears in the first week or two. Then these crazy symptoms show up, and they don't leave. Palpitations, arrhythmias, blood clots, dementia, loss of taste and smell, hearing problems. All of these are being reported as long COVID symptoms. What is causing that? Well, that's the question that answers your question. So in China, in January of 2020, it was published what was causing all the symptoms of what was being called COVID pneumonia in those people in the hospitals in Wuhan, China, in the fall of 2019. And this may be something you haven't heard, but this is how you know this came from a lab. When we talk about lab creation, lab leaks, it wasn't leaked, it was intentionally released. So there are labs all around the world that are creating synthetic poisons. They have learned how to spread them around the world. In January of 2020, the Chinese researchers who were commissioned by the government of China to go test the blood of all the sick people in Wuhan for this novel new virus, they actually published that the antibodies their bodies were producing to fight this pneumonia were actually antibodies against two specific snake venom proteins. from a king cobra and from a crate snake in China. They published that in a peer-reviewed published paper. You can still read it. That the origin of COVID was two isolated venom proteins from these two snakes that actually cause neurological symptoms by binding to what are called nicotine receptors to lead to hypoxia, the drop in your blood pressure, your oxygen levels, to cause you to lose your taste and smell, to cause tinnitus, dementia, and difficulty breathing, fever, and body chills that look like COVID or a respiratory virus.
So is that why that smokers were sometimes immune to some of these side effects?
This has been one of the most shocking things to everybody around the world when we do presentations. The doctors you mentioned earlier, we have testified in state capitol buildings all over this country and all over this world in the last 4 years. This is one of the most shocking revelations. A respiratory disease called COVID-19, this virus spreading throughout the world we're all inhaling that causes horrific death and misery and illness. They have published over and over and over since the beginning of COVID in the mainstream media that there seems to be a paradox with this illness. Smokers appear immune to COVID-19 and this respiratory virus. It is still to this day that smokers are the least infected with COVID, least hospitalized with COVID, and ever died from COVID-19 of all demographics, age, gender, it doesn't matter, race. It is always smokers were the least affected, which is weird to most scientists and medical professionals.
Because we know smoking's not good for your lungs, obviously.
You would think they had lung disease that would make them more susceptible to a lung infection.
Right.
However, I mentioned China in January 2020. In April of 2020, that mystery was answered by researchers in France. And I show you that study in the book, Moving Beyond COVID-19 Lies. These two French researchers actually requested the spike proteins of COVID from the UK and China, and they shipped them to them. And they ran DNA analysis on them and wanted to know, what are they identical to? And they published they are most similar to two snake venom proteins, the king cobra and the crate snake's venom called cobra toxin and bungaro toxin. And they state in the paper, this finally answers. This is in April of 2020, you guys, 4 years ago. They said this finally answers the riddle why scientists and medical professionals around the world are perplexed at two things: why smokers don't get COVID and why ivermectin is working against COVID. This information answered both those questions because these venom proteins actually target nicotine receptors, not ACE2 receptors like we were all taught with COVID. They bind to nicotine receptors, which perfectly explain every symptom of COVID and long COVID. And they published that nicotine is the antidote, and even wrote in the study, if all governments around the world would just use nicotine gum, nicotine patches, nicotine agents, they could end the pandemic in 2 weeks around the world.
Wow.
But instead, Dr. Anthony Fauci decided to go into the media the very next week in May of 2020 and tell the whole world that scientists have figured out new data. Smokers are the most affected by COVID, most hospitalized with COVID, and most to die with COVID. So there's no better time than now to quit using tobacco products.
And what about ivermectin? Why was it also working? Because
this was a huge aha moment for me.
Okay.
They actually answered this too. So these same nicotine receptors that these venom proteins called spike proteins are targeting, they published in that paper that ivermectin also binds to these same nicotine receptors, and it is called a positive allosteric modulator of alpha-7 nicotine receptors, which for scientists out there and medical professionals, you know what that means.
Yeah, but we don't, so explain to us what we don't.
It means it binds to nicotine receptors like nicotine does from tobacco products.
Yeah.
And now those venom proteins or spike proteins cannot bind to your cells to make you sick, and your body just pees them out, poops them out, sweats them out as God designed.
Wow. And so ivermectin has kind of been like a wonder drug in all of this. Even like for other viruses, why does ivermectin work? Why is it still an important drug for like traveling and stuff?
Yeah, so ivermectin is a godsend and has been since it was discovered. Ivermectin helps at actually eliminating parasites, all types of parasites, including the big worms called helminths and nematodes, roundworms. But when it comes to viruses, what I've discovered is that over the last 3 years of research that I've done, all you gotta do is go onto any medical journal's website and type in the name of a virus and nicotine receptors, and you will see every virus published by man they know targets nicotine receptors. And the fact that ivermectin is a positive binder to nicotine receptors, this is the preventative measure I perfectly can explain how it helps to remove any concerns of multiple viruses. including, did you know nicotine's a cure for rabies and HIV? And it's
Wow.
published by medical scientists around the world.
So what is it about? Because obviously you don't agree with smoking. That's not healthy for you. But it's the combination of what in the cigarette that's bad?
Yeah, so this is great. In the book, I actually write this because so many people, when I talk about nicotine and this benefit, it appeared, of using tobacco
They think they're going to go smoke. No, we don't want you to go smoke.
We want you to get the book. We want you to get the book.
Amen. Get the book. Get the book.
Go ahead and finish your
Yeah, so what's in the book I write, there's a chapter 13, it's titled Just in the Nicotine of Time. Anybody out there with any symptoms I mentioned earlier?
like a little Batman thing, right?
That's right. Just in the nicotine of time. It is published in medical journals and by the NIH that in 2023, they took long COVID patients who couldn't get rid of any of their symptoms for a year and a half. And they asked them to do one thing and one thing only. Wear a 7 milligram nicotine patch for 6 days only, and let's see if your years of suffering disappear. Not 50%, not 70%, not 90% of all long COVID symptoms disappeared in days. It was 100% of all long COVID symptoms disappeared with a 7 milligram nicotine patch for only 6 days. Ask your doctor if nicotine's right for you.